Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 2021 Henry Marshall Tory Lecture. My name is Luca Vanzella, and I am the president of the Friends of the University of Alberta. We are very pleased to have Andy Knight with us this evening to present the lecture. I'd like to take a few moments to tell you about the Friends of the University of Alberta before we get going. Established in 1943, the Friends is a group of volunteers with a mission to build and nurture a community that celebrates and champions the University of Alberta. We work to encourage connections between the university and the community. And I'd like to briefly highlight a few of the initiatives of the Friends. Since 1956, we have hosted the Henry Marshall Tory Lectures. These are free public lectures featuring renowned speakers to engage the broader community in front-of-mind topics. The Friends have also endowed 6 annual student scholarships and offer 4 annual student awards, including a graduate student award for students in grad studies. We're also very proud to support 2 U of A programs that connect the broader community with the university. One of these programs is U-School, a program run by the University of Alberta Senate that introduces students in grades 4 through 9 from socially vulnerable or Aboriginal or rural communities to the University of Alberta for an on-campus experience. The other program is called Humanities 101, and this is run by the Faculty of Arts. It offers free, non-credit university-level courses for Albertans with a passion for learning, but whose circumstances have certain barriers that make post-secondary education inaccessible. And as the Friends approach our 8th decade of service to the university and the community, we welcome anyone who is interested in the U of A to join us. No prior connection to the university is required. All you need is an interest in the university. There are no membership fees, and we do not solicit for donations. Being a friend, you will be the first to receive notices of events that we are holding, like this evening's Tory Lecture. To find out more about our initiatives or to join us, visit the website friendsoftheuofa.ca. or follow us on Twitter at Friends of the U of A. And now a little bit about the Tory Lecture Series. This lecture series is named in memory of Henry Marshall Tory, the Dean of Canadian Educationists in the first half of the 20th century, and the first president of the University of Alberta, having essentially created it from nothing in 1908. Tory's legacy in Canadian education and research is vast. Besides the University of Alberta, Tory was also principal founder of what are now the University of British Columbia, the Alberta Research Council, the National Research Council, and Carleton University. Tory was a man of his times and exactly suited to his period of Canadian history. Teacher, preacher, philosopher, man of action, and conspicuous scientist. Without leaving treatises or formal scientific contributions in papers or memoirs on specific research, he was a great missionary and proponent of research, and he contributed greatly to the adoption of science to his country's needs. Without leaving any formal dissertation of philosophy, he was a philosopher of education, and without serving in any legislative hall, he became the Canadian statesman at large for both science and education. Tory was a great initiator and founder of learning institutions designed to last. And now I'd like to proceed to this evening's Tory Lecture. A couple of housekeeping things. If you have questions that you would like to ask Andy, please use the Q&A feature in your Zoom window. Our behind-the-scenes volunteers will accumulate the questions, and I will ask them of Andy at the end of the talk. And also, by the way, this talk is being recorded, and it will be posted on our YouTube channel for later viewing. Now I'd like to introduce this evening's guest speaker. Andy, if you could please turn on your video. All right. Andy Knight is a professor of international relations and political science in the political science department at the University of Alberta. A fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, Andy was named by Venture magazine among Alberta's top 50 most influential people, and by Black Business and Professional Association of Canada as the Harry Jerome Trailblazer. Andy is the former director of the Institute of International Relations, the University of West Indies, co-founder of the Diplomatic Academy of the Caribbean, and during his secondment in the Caribbean, Knight established the Caribbean Journal of International Relations and Diplomacy. and he was co-editor of the highly regarded and award-winning journal Global Governance. Andy serves as co-editor-in-chief of the African Security Journal and the International Journal. Andy has written several books on the United Nations, global politics, and the responsibility to protect. One of his most recently published books is the award-winning Female Suicide Bombings, a critical gendered approach. Earlier this year, in March of 2021, Andy was awarded the University of Alberta's highest honor, University of Alberta Distinguished Professor. Andy is currently the Fulbright Distinguished Chair in International Area Studies at Yale University. Andy's using his opportunity as a Fulbright Scholar at Yale to shed new light on the New World Disorder and delve into the messy transition as multiple nations jockey for power. He is working on a new book about the changing face of global governance and the transition to the New World Order. Andy joins us this evening from Yale. Welcome, Andy.
Thank you very much, Luca, and it's great to be with you. I wish that we could be there in person. I can see the beautiful buildings in the background there, Luca, and I kind of miss the University of Alberta for that reason. This talk is about governing disorder in our intermestic world. And I know for those of you who have been following political, cultural, and socioeconomic trends since the end of the Cold War, our world appears to be increasingly ungovernable. The post-Cold War world has been marked by the intensification of hyper-globalization with all its attendant negative effects. We are now living in what can be called an interregnum, a period that signals a transformation from one world order to the next. It's a period of turbulence, uncertainty, flux, and confusion. And folks, we are in the midst of a new world disorder. The institutions of global governance that were created 75 years ago to manage and address the global problems we encounter and to steer us into a future that is more peaceful, stable, equitable, just, sustainable, and prosperous. Those institutions have become decisions frozen in time. I argue here that it bears repeating, that the extant institutions of global governance, including but not limited to the United Nations, are more or less decisions frozen in time, created at a juncture in our history when sovereignty-bound entities, that is Westphalian nation states, reigned supreme. Today, those institutions are being forced to operate in a turbulent, complex, interdependent, and intermestic era in which sovereignty-free actors, that is non-state actors, and sovereignty-bound actors, nation states, compete and jostle for positions on the global stage. The clear lines of demarcation that separated what goes on within the state from what goes on outside of the state, those clear lines have become so blurred today that global institutions are having a very difficult time dealing with the transnational challenges of the 21st century. And under the ellipsoidal glare and intensity of the spotlight, post-World War II institutions of global governance are revealing themselves to be defective, inefficient, ineffective, and largely irrelevant to the 21st century. The crisis of global governance at this particular juncture in our history has triggered an intense and growing interest in governance at all levels. The time is now ripe for a reconceptualization of governance and for the construction of a new global governance paradigm. And to do so, it may be necessary to shift from problem-solving theorization to embrace a more critical theory approach, one that basically stands outside prevailing understandings of what global governance has come to mean. And in the Gramscian tradition, the late Robert Cox, who was one of my mentors and one of my former teachers, he once proposed that we should examine empirically the patchwork concoction that makes up the architecture of global governance, and to do so against the backdrop of what the late James Rosenau described as a post-Cold War fragmentative and complex environment within which that architecture was constructed. It is in this moment of transition in which we're living, when the forces of integration are colliding with those of fragmentation, that we sense the need for a new lens that would allow us to see more clearly what is needed to build effective, efficient governance at the international level. It has to be efficient, effective, and relevant for the emerging new world order. The time has come for us to turn our focus away from simply tinkering with the existing governance institutions and instead ask ourselves the question, what institutional transformation are necessary for governance in our intermestic world? It is unlikely that the political will exists at this particular moment for the construction of a world order, of a world government. We certainly have had the experience over the past 75 years of governing without government. How should we plan to govern during the rest of the 21st century? During this period of interregnum in which we are living, this time of great uncertainty, what type of institutional transformations might we envision for the future? This, of course, requires a Kuhnian-type paradigm shift away from the embedded Westphalian state-centric idea of international, anarchic, and hierarchical forms of governance, to one that embodies notions of heterarchic, multi-level, multicentric, multiplex governance, arrangements that anchor themselves in principles of inclusivity and subsidiarity. And we'll get to those terms in a moment. Those principles are conducive to self-organizing steering of multiple and multi-level agencies, whether they be states and non-state, public and private, multilateral or plurilateral, which are able to function as operationally autonomous, yet structurally coupled due to their mutual interdependence. What I'm calling for is to imagine a new way to govern in an intermestic and disordered world. I'm going to move on to the new world order. Now, global politics in the early part of the 21st century has been dominated by genocide, gruesome acts of rampant terrorism, suicide bombings, multilateral and unilateral reprisals, global economic downturns, turmoil, the violation of international treaties, mounting civil strife, concatenated violence, insurrection, revolutions, anarchy, war crimes, crimes against humanity, mass rape, ethnic cleansing, pandemics, and ecological degradation. I hope you're watching the COP26 in Scotland and see some of the speakers talk about some of these problems that we face. This turbulent time reveals cracks, if not a total breakdown in the prevailing global order, and has led to ever louder demands for the establishment of a new institution of global governance to replace at least complement the worn existing ones. This is not the first time in history when prevailing systems of governance have been challenged by pronounced structural forces that induced the need for change within the system. In past centuries, there have been repeated attempts at bringing order to global chaos by reforming existing institutions or by creating new ones to tame this disorder of the period. This was usually done via the steering of an orderer, a predominant or hegemonic power, or primus inter pares, to use the Latin term. More recently, during the immediate post-Cold War period, we witnessed the removal of some of the structural and ideological underpinnings of the superpower conflict that characterized the last half of the previous century. Apart from relaxing global tensions, this changed structural condition ostensibly reduced the major security threat that the world faced during the Cold War, that is, the threat of nuclear war between two heavily armed military camps that could have resulted in mutual assured destruction. But the end of that precarious balance of power between the two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, created a climate of uncertainty with an upswing in the number of civil conflicts and with the spread of internecine violence in places like Afghanistan, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in Rwanda, Somalia, in Sudan, in the former Yugoslavia. In the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, there have been approximately 93 conflicts around the world, in which over 5.5 million people have been killed, 75% of them civilians. Almost all of these conflicts were intrastate, and thus explaining the disproportionate number of civilian casualties. Now, the immediate post-Cold War period was also characterized by an exponential increase in transnational challenges. Some of those challenges included the horizontal proliferation of nuclear weapons, the spike in the illicit trade in small arms and light weapons, the spread of material and ideologies of hate, the spread of hate material and ideologies of hate, the increased consumption of pornography and sexual slavery, computer hacking and cyber theft, an increase in drug trafficking, trafficking in women and children, an increase in mass migration and the number of internally displaced persons, forced labor and organized criminal activity, financial market collapses, piracy on the high seas, especially in the Malacca Strait and off the coast of Somalia and Nigeria, the circumvention of national regulatory policies and taxes, etc. Now, clearly, the national institutions of the Westphalian states system, which we've come to know very well since 1648, they are supposed to express people's preferences in those matters, and they are increasingly becoming ineffective in coping with them. The post-World War II institutions like the United Nations system, the Bretton Woods institutions, the International Monetary Fund, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, or the IBRD, and the General Tariffs on Trade and General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT, which is now the WTO, the World Trade Organization. These were supposed to address interstate conflicts during the Cold War and challenges to the political and economic stability around the globe were all of a sudden showing signs by the end of the Cold War, not only of the ineffectiveness, but also the irrelevance of these institutions. And many of the regional institutions did not fare any better. Think of the African Union or the European Union and ASEAN and so on. This raised the alert among scholars and practitioners of the need for a new global governance architecture which would effectively deal with transnational and intermestic issues. But then we have the debacle in Somalia, the Rwanda genocide, at times indiscriminate but politically motivated slaughter in the DRC, in Sierra Leone, in Liberia, Mozambique, in Cote d'Ivoire, in Sudan, both north and south, and the continued violence in other places such as Afghanistan, Israel-Palestine, Yemen, Chechnya, East Timor, Jammu Kashmir, Haiti, Nigeria, parts of Latin America, all indicate a persistent adherence to a culture of violence as hypernationalism, terrorism, and long-suppressed ethnic conflicts reared their ugly heads in the latter part of the 21st century. In the latter part of the 20th century, And the United Nations Security Council, with its 5 veto-wielding permanent powers, have failed to arrest this trend. Other human tragedies and gross human rights violations occurred in so-called failed states, where the degeneration of total absence of national governance structures meant that civilians were particularly vulnerable to random acts of violence, to kidnappings, to murders, sexual assaults, and so on. Just think of Myanmar today and Libya. These are good examples of this. Millions of innocent people fleeing violence have become refugees and displaced persons, some internally displaced, some externally displaced. And thousands of children have been and continue to be recruited as child soldiers by both government and rebel forces. The destruction of national infrastructures and of governmental societal institutions to the tune of billions of dollars, trillions of dollars in some cases, was due at times to internecine violence, but also at other times to natural disasters and man-made disasters during this immediate post-Cold War period. Again, national governments have found it difficult to address the spillover problems associated with both internal conflicts as well as humanitarian disasters. Similarly, international governmental organizations like the United Nations system and regional intergovernmental bodies like NATO and the EU and the African Union, they've all struggled to cope with the increasingly transnational and intermestic nature of these problems. Now, the narrative I've just painted is a panoramic view of what can only be referred to as a new world disorder, an environment of turbulence, an environment of flux, fragmentation, disequilibrium, and uncertainty. And this cries out for the establishment of novel forms of governance institutions, since the existing ones seem woefully ineffective and woefully inadequate. But this picture is just one part of the puzzle. There are other integrative and fragmentary forces at work, which are also putting pressure on the existing international governance architecture. And this leads me to the section on complex interdependence and globalization forces. The late James Rosenau alerted us to some of the ways in which the advent of dynamic technologies has resulted in a decline of distances, as he put it, in the modern world. He calls it the distant proximities. Technological advances in communications and transportation have resulted in an increase in the level of complex interdependence. And that's to use a phrase that was coined by Robert Cohane and Joseph Nye. Modern communications in the form of newspapers, radio, television, telephones, fax machines, lasers, quantum computing, quantum mechanics, semiconductor chips, laptops, tablets, smartphones, the internet, email, social media, GPS, artificial intelligence, electric cars, hybrid cars, driverless cars, all these appear to be producing contradictory outcomes. In some cases, uniting people, in other cases, fragmenting audiences, exacerbating social cleavages, as well as bringing disparate groups together, heightening existing antagonisms, as well as providing means through which such frictions can be resolved, eroding national boundaries, as well as propelling ultranationalist fervor, increasing political cynicism, as well as raising the level of civil society's political consciousness. These are all together very much colliding and different kinds of processes that are happening within the international community. Individual citizens have been empowered as a result of media influences, but they've also used the media to divide themselves. At the same time, because of their adeptness with the utilization of modern communication systems, state leaders have been empowered vis-a-vis civil society. Modern transportation has allowed people of formerly distant societies to interact more frequently with one another. It acts as a conduit for bringing individuals from different countries with similar interests together. But it also serves to facilitate, in some cases, transnational criminal activities. So the overall effect of what I've just said has been a shrinkage in social, political, economic, and cultural distances. As a consequence of this phenomenon, formerly dense and opaque frontiers are being dissolved, thus breaking down the Westphalian notion of inside versus outside. That's why I call it intermestic rather than international now. National boundaries are no longer able to divide friend from foe. Indeed, technological revolution has the potential for creating in the minds of people around the world a sense of global citizenship, which could result eventually in the transfer of individuals' loyalties from sovereignty-bound to sovereignty-free global governance bodies. The changing relationship between the public and private spheres, and the virtual collapse of the dividing line that separated domestic from external environments, suggests a fluid but closely integrated global system, substantially at odds with the notion of a fragmented system of nationally delineated sovereign states. However, it does not yet mean that a global civil society has been formed, although we can argue that such an entity is in the process of being established, as will be shown later. Aided by the technological revolution, globalization has contributed to global space and time shrinkage. The globalization of trade, of production, of finance has resulted in a marked decline in some governance ability to control these sectors and has challenged the traditional conception of state sovereignty. It has also expanded the number of players that can be involved in the multilateral processes. The globalization movement itself and the seemingly paradoxical adherence to territorialism are two concepts of world order that stand in conflict with one another, but are also integrated. The globalization of economic processes require the backing of territorially based state power to enforce its rules, But post-Fordist thinking, the new patterns of social organization or production that is congruent with globalization phenomena, implicitly contradicts the lingering territorial principle that has long been identified with Fordism. The results of post-Fordism and post-Fordist production have been, among other things, the dismantling of the welfare state, the diminishing of the strength of organized labor, but has also had the effect of increasingly fragmenting power in the world system, the diffusion of power, providing fodder for the possibility of culturally diverse alternatives to global homogenization. If Robert Cost is right, we can see how this dialectical double movement of the globalization process can actually alter the relationship that people have between or with their political arena, and how it can eventually cause a reaction leading to what James Rosenow has termed explosive subgroupism. Explosive subgroupism, as seen in many of the anti-globalization protests that we've seen recently. This subgroupism has already spurred the revival of what can be called civilizational studies that are further unearthing anti-globalization movements, ideas, and also the bottom-up form of global governance. There are other ways in which globalization is facilitating the dissolution of formerly dense and opaque boundaries. For instance, economic globalization has resulted in a global division of labor that hardly respects state boundaries and the Westphalian sovereignty. It has to a large extent spurred on the feminization of work, particularly in the developing world, which has penetrated traditional gender boundaries. The international movement of capital via electronic transfers has also had a major effect on the relocation of authority and power structures. And similarly, media globalization via networks like CNN and BBC and Al Jazeera and the international superhighway social media has contributed to this subgroupism, and with it, the diffusion of power. Its impact raises the possibility of the development of a truly global civil society, something that could transform the nature of multilateralism as we know it, and the way in which we view global governance. Finally, another challenge to the traditional notion of multilateralism and global governance has to do with transnational and intermestic issues. For example, environmental pollution, global warming, currency crises, the drug trade, human rights degeneration, terrorism, the outbreak of epidemics and pandemic-prone diseases like HIV/AIDS, SARS, MERS, influenza, Ebola, cholera, dengue, Rift Valley fever, chikungunya, and now COVID-19. The rise in non-communicable diseases, the rise in refugee flows, etc. These issues, by their very nature, all impel cooperation on a transnational scale, since in most cases they cannot be resolved by individual states acting on their own, or even acting bilaterally with other states. Now, multicentric actors have pushed many of these issues onto the global agenda. The impact of the multiplicity, the multiplication of transnational and intermestic problems is that the state-centric multilateral intergovernmental institutions, like the United Nations system, have had to find ways of acknowledging, if not embracing, the input coming from NGOs and other civil society actors, most of whom are formally, but would not have been considered formally important players on the international stage. The alternative of not embracing these entities could very well mean the establishment of parallel multilateral arrangements that simply bypass the existing state structure, state-centric multilateral bodies, or compete with them. James Rosnow reminded us that we live in a messy world, a world that seems in disarray due to the high levels of poverty, division, ethnic and cultural conflicts, terrorism, overpopulation, pollution, and other forms of environmental degradation. Our world is a postmodern one of extraordinary complexity and uncertainty as contradictory forces are unleashing by the intensification of globalization, intensification of globalization. It is a world in which integrated forces coexist alongside fragmentary ones, and homogenization is being challenged by civilizational diversity. What is clear from my overview so far is that complex interdependence and globalization phenomenon have challenged international governance and raised the possibility of developing other forms of governance at multiple levels that can adequately address transnational and intermestic issues and problems. So I want to move on quickly to evolving governance at a global level before I bring this talk to an end. Now, while the term global governance is relatively new, the word governance has a long tradition. Etymological searches reveal that the term can be traced back to classical Latin and Greek words meaning the steering of boats. The steering of boats. Now, originally the word governance, therefore, referred to the action or ways of managing or coordinating interdependent activity. Last year, I asked one of my research assistants at the University of Alberta, Grace Lee, who is now a law student at Duke University, to compile the many different definitions of governance from a vast interdisciplinary literature that we collected. In that etymological exercise, the student identified 30 concepts of governance. And throughout history, there have been attempts to manage the interactions of peoples, clans, tribes, city-states, and then states to ensure harmonious relations in dealing with common problems. One can find examples of these various governances over the course of history, including empires, balance of power, plurilateral and transversal bodies, formal and informal limited purpose intergovernmental organizations, formal and informal multi-purpose international organizations, regional international organizations, trans-regional bodies, transnational non-governmental organizations, regimes, and even embryonic centralized global governance institutions. The form of governance labeled as empires, for example, has long associations with imperialism. It is a form of governance that has recurred at different points in history and in many different regions around the globe. Imperialism provides the ideology underpinning empires. Imperial powers exercise dominance and control over subjugated regions they conquer. And as a result, they develop a form of governance that is based on power asymmetries, coercion, attempts to enforce homogeneity. One can find evidence of governance by empires that date all the way back to the Greek city-states of Athens, when Athens was a dominant power in the 5th century BCE. But this form of governance has reappeared at different junctures in history, including during our contemporary period. And each time it has appeared, it manages to provoke resistance among those subjugated to that particular form of governance. Imperial powers have usually declined due in large part to military, economic, and imperial overstretch, as my colleague here at Yale, Paul Kennedy, has written in the Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. Now, another prominent form of governance has been the balance of power system. This form of governance emerged after the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 and the creation of the modern state system. It became the principal mechanism for maintaining international order in Europe. Underpinning the balance of power system were the ideological notions of self-preservation, particularly for those states that were predominant, the preservation of the status quo. To accomplish these things, great powers of the day would use this balance of power mechanism to prevent the emergence of a hegemonic or imperial power from taking over, and prevent upstart powers from advancing up the hierarchical power ladder. Although diplomacy was utilized to manage the relationship between states in the Eurocentric balance of power system, at other times, balance of power governance utilized violent conflict to maintain equilibrium in the international system. So war, or the threat of war, was generally used as a means of preserving equilibrium within the international system. Now, political realists have described the balance of power well as one in which independent rational actor states have little interaction beyond their borders, and one that emphasized order and stability over things like justice and fairness and human rights. By the 19th century, the balance of power form of governance gave way to a series of ad hoc and plurilateral conferences and congresses. You probably heard about the congresses in Europe and Council of Europe. Eventually, it broadened to include states in Latin America and Asia, thus expanding the scope of plurilateral multilateralism. However, because the congresses were intermittent, this form of governance stopped short of establishing intergovernmental institutions. In fact, by the mid-19th century, the Council of Europe became the first attempt at formalizing intergovernmental organizations to govern interstate relations as contact between states increased. And this led to the creation of organizations like the League of Nations and also the the United Nations. I think Craig Murphy once recalled in the late 19th century that there were other challenges coming to this form of governance from civil society organizations, which began to establish a presence on the global stage. Such organizations included the anti-slavery movement and financial and corporate interests, as well as private associations. This parallel non-state system of governance, combined with the emergent powers beyond Europe, and with a dramatic increase in the volume, scope, and international activity, caused some major strain on the ad hoc conferences and congresses government system. Ines Claude once put it, when all is said and done, the political conference system contributed more to the awareness of the problems of international collaboration than to their solutions, and more to the opening up of the possibility of multilateral diplomacy than to realizing them. But the Congress system did make a significant contribution to the institutions of the modern day multilateral system because it got European governments into the habit of meeting together to discuss and to iron out their problems. At the start of the 20th century, great efforts were made to establish more formal institutions of governance. And we can talk about the League of Nations. I'll skip over the League of Nations, but I'll tell you, the United Nations became the symbol of this kind of governance. The United States, one of the world's emerging powers, never took membership in the League of Nations. By the late 1930s, most of the disaffected powers like Germany, Japan, and Russia left this intergovernmental organization as well. And these major powers that remain, including Britain and France, were unwilling for a variety of domestic and foreign policy considerations to provide the League with the kind of support it needed to respond to the political military challenges that developed in the international system during the 1930s. For some historians, the war that began in 1939 was simply a continuation of a European-wide war that had not in fact ended in 1919, but merely paused as the combatants regained strength and armor. So it's not surprising that World War II occurred, and including the emergence of fascist regimes in Germany and Italy, led respectively by Hitler and Mussolini. The demise of the League of Nations once World War II began indicated that the system of governance at that time via intergovernmental organizations needed to be reformed at the very least. And this is when the United Nations was formed. In August 1941, the United Nations came into being. The emerging great power of the United States worked alongside the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill to establish what became known as the Atlantic Charter. The charter was formed on the basis, the charter formed the basis for the Declaration of the United Nations, which was signed on the 1st of January 1942 in San Francisco by some 26 governments. Essentially, that declaration was an attempt to introduce a permanent form of global governance for the entire global security of the globe. Now, victorious allies were envisioning to be at the center of this new system. And of course, that new system created the Security Council with five permanent members having the veto. I'm going to skip over a little bit here because I know you're probably getting tired and I want to bring this to an end fairly quickly. Now, one of the things that we've noticed since the creation of the United Nations was the emergence of a number of numerous formal groupings. You know about the group, the G2, the group of two, the group of three, the G7/G8, the group of 20, the group of 21, the group of 25, the G77, and the G90. There are now seemingly ubiquitous numbers of coalitions of the willing, including top-down ones brought in by the United States and NATO against Iraq and Afghanistan, or the bottom-up ones such as the Landmines Treaty in Ottawa to end landmines, or the Human Security Network organized by middle powers. And there are subaltern groupings such as the Forum of Small States, OASIS, and the Small Island Developing States, to name a few, that act almost like coalitions of the willing in order to get their concerns placed higher up on the international agenda. This considerable variety of intergovernmental bodies forms only one element of global governance. There are a number of scholars that suggest that international governance consists of the output of non-hierarchical network of interlocking international institutions, which regulate the behavior of states and other international actors in different issues of world politics. For these people, global governance is the output of non-hierarchical network of international and transnational institutions, not only intergovernmental bodies and international regimes, but also transnational regimes are regulating actors' behavior. In other words, they differentiate global governance from international governance by suggesting that in the case of the former, there is a decreased salience of states and increased salience of non-state actors in the process of norm building, rule setting, compliance monitoring that occurs at the global level. They also equate global governance with multi-level governance, involving the management of processes at subnational, national, regional, transregional, and global governance. Let me end with a conclusion about where I think we are today. The multiplicity of governance forms that we've witnessed over the last 4 or 5 decades is a clear indication that we are struggling to find the right mixture of global governance. Now, global governance refers to more than formal institutions. It can include informal networks, regimes that can be involved in global governance. Indeed, the bulk of cross-border transactions these days are managed to a large extent by informal regimes. Principles, norms, rules, practices, and decision-making procedures around which actors adhere. While national governments and the United Nations system are very much central to the activities of global governance, they only form part of the overall picture of global governance. I think the Commission on Global Governance defined this form of governance as the sum of the many ways in which individuals and institutions, both public and private, manage their common affairs. And this definition is broad enough to allow for the participation not just of state actors, but also of non-state actors and of influential people in the system of global governance. That's basically what I'm advocating tonight. The questions that need to be resolved at this stage, now that we're looking at the possibility of a new world order coming out of this world of disorder, we have to come to the realization that there's a need for a new conception of global governance to match what's occurring on the ground. Even states have begun to realize that governing the globe requires the cooperation not only of fellow state actors, but also of non-state actors. In the past, state-centric intergovernmental organizations have tended to act as a conservative force against any radical change by conforming to the status quo or by further institutionalizing the present international framework. But those days, my friends, have passed. For humankind to survive on this planet, in this global neighborhood, we need a network of governance institutions that include multi-purpose and limited purpose international organizations, but also embrace international non-governmental organizations, transnational corporate bodies, civil society organizations, and influential individuals. This is what I like to call summative global governance architecture that's needed at this particular point in our history. But one of the final things I'd like to say is that this emerging system of global governance will resemble more like a network that has links to multiple centers of authority at multiple levels, at universal, continental, transregional, regional, subregional, transregional, national, subnational, and local. Some authors have referred to this as multi-level governance. My friend Amitav Acharya at American University labels this quite accurately as multiplex governance. It's a kind of governance that requires a subsidiarity principle to guide its operation, particularly because the power is now so diffused within the international system. It's a kind of governance that is more sophisticated and flexible than previous forms, and it may be able to provide the space and time for traditional intergovernmental institutions to make the needed transformation that's necessary to become not only more efficient, effective, but also more relevant in the 21st century. Thank you very much for your attention.
All right, thank you, Andy. You have given me a lot to think about. I was actually formulating a few questions, but some have come in on the Q&A, so I'll hold off on those. But except for one, this messy transition that you spoke about, how long do you think it'll take? Like if you gaze into the far off future, it's messy, but I imagine it's slow. How long do you think it'll take?
Well, this is a challenge for us now because it's obviously we're obviously living in this interregnum. I like to use that term interregnum. It reminds me of Arnold Toynbee and his view of history, that there are certain periods of time that become transitional moments in history when you move from one world order to the next. It's hard to put a sort of a specific date or time line on how long this messy period will continue. But what I can say is that when you see the ideas and the institutions and the material capabilities which made the foundation of world order, when you see those things begin to be challenged by other ideas, other institutions, other material capabilities, then that's when you know that it's time for change. And I think begin to see these challenges today. Look at the attacks on the so-called liberal world order. There are many attacks on the liberal world order, the ideas that sort of formulated the United Nations system and the institutions that govern us since 1945. Think about the United Nations system and all the attacks on the UN system for its failures in many parts of the world and its inability to deal with some of the major crises around the globe. And you start to think about the League of Nations and similar kinds of failures when the League of Nations ended. And I think about the shifting hegemonies that are occurring today. The United States seems to be slipping in hegemony. China seems to be on the rise. There's certainly new actors like the BRICS and others that are coming into play. So we have to wait until all these things play out in this messy transitional moment before we can actually even see the design of a new order to come. But I think that time is coming. And it may take the end of the 21st century before it happens because we're right in the midst of this turmoil and flux. But I think the time will eventually come because in the course of history, disorder has always been an indication that one world order is being transitioned to another world order. So I don't think we are in a new space in that sense. So we can expect that there will be a new world order on the horizon, but how long will it take is hard, is anyone's guess right now.
Okay, thank you. Ken asks, how do we move the world toward a more global governance or cooperative model at a time that it seems the major powers would presumably like to be have to be participants? They appear to be moving further apart and becoming more nationalistically entrenched.
That's a challenge. And I think that's one of the challenges I try to bring out in my talk today. The big powers that used to support, the hegemonic powers that used to support the world order as we knew it in 1945, those powers are sometimes now challenging the ideas, and the institutions that formulated that world order. And the United States is a good example of this. Even within the United States, domestically, the country is divided. As January 6th pointed out, we almost had an insurrection in the United States of America. And the United States, the biggest, the most powerful state in the international system, most predominant state, is having difficulties dealing with some of the problems I raised, from migration to the vulnerabilities that come from hurricanes and floods and fires and all that sort of thing. The United States is having difficulty, and it's one of the strongest powers in the world. So imagine the small states and what they're going through and the vulnerabilities that they face. For them, it's existential. For them, it's a matter of survival. For the United States, it's a matter of trying to sort of hold on to what they consider to be, that unilateral moment that they've experienced before, and try to hold on to their power. But the power is slipping, and the power has become so diffused that I don't think we're going to ever have another hegemonic power. In fact, I definitely agree with Robert Cox, who used to say that we're moving towards a post-hegemonic world, a world in which no big power is going to want to take on the role of hegemony because it comes with such a burden. So unfortunately, I think, we are moving to this, this disintegration of the existing world order. And maybe it's a necessary disintegration if you're going to have something come from it that's going to be new and that's going to be more inclusive, that will be more equal, that will be more diverse, and that will somehow reflect the diversity of the international community.
Ken had a follow-up question. Is it possible to achieve global stability without first having the horrific and horrendous prospect of global conflagration that bankrupts the warring factions and causes their populations to tire of conflict? It's a frightening and somewhat demoralizing prospect.
It is, and and if you look back into history, I think Paul Kennedy, in his book, The Rise and Fall of Great Powers, you can see evidence of that kind of disintegration that occurs before a new order comes into being. The good thing about it is that sometimes this, to me, it signals that there's a new order on the horizon. It's just that we have to have the political will, and we have to have the wherewithal to build that new world order, and it has to be built on certain foundations, like I mentioned: inclusivity, diversity, bringing in the people who are marginalized over many years, the indigeneity that has to be included, the rise of, you can see this in the rise of anti-globalization movements and what they're asking for, people who are being subjected to the vulnerabilities that come from hurricanes and floods and earthquakes and so on. All these people have to be at the table in the creation of this new order. Remember, in 1945, most of these people were not present there. There were only 26 states at the very beginning when the charter was being formulated, and then 50 states when the charter was actually signed. So I think this is a time for us, this moment of interregnum, as they like to put it, is a time for us to reflect. It's a time for us to listen. It's a time for us to conceive of what's possible, and not allow the voices of realism that tend to sort of make you depressed about the current moment, not allow that to sort of stymie the vision of a better future ahead.
Okay, next question. How would you characterize the relationship between US, China, and Russia? Cold War-ish or cooperative competition?
US, China, and Russia. Well, in some ways, some people might want to think about it as a new Cold War, but I tend to differ with that. What we're seeing, what we're witnessing, is the decline of the United States as a hegemonic power. And what we're witnessing is the attempts by Russia to tenaciously hold on to power that is completely lost. Russia is not the Soviet Union. And then what we see with China is, the Belt and Road Initiative and its ability to create new institutions of governance and its more active participation in the existing governance. I think what you see is China as a country that's trying to climb the ladder, the international hierarchy ladder. And it's now gaining on the United States in many different realms. But as I say in my talk, I believe that China is not ready either for becoming a hegemonic power. In fact, if you talk to many Chinese colleagues, they'll tell you that the Chinese are not interested in hegemony. They see hegemony as a dirty word. And they are more concerned with what they call the rise of China, but in the sort of partnership form, having partners with Africa or partners with the Caribbean, partners with Latin America, as opposed to the kind of hegemonic role that we've seen in the past with subjugated actors to the hegemon. So China has a different strategy, and I think the United States is not yet learning how to deal with this strategy. But I don't think it's possible for us to predict how China will go in the future, because It has its own internal problems to worry about. It has problems in the north of China. It has problems in Hong Kong. It has problems with Taiwan. In Asia, it has difficulties. So it's not going to be a foregone conclusion that that China will become the next hegemon. But I do think that it is rising in influence and rising in power. We have to see whether or not the world is willing to embrace the kind of ideology that China wants to espouse, and we have to wait and see. I mean, it's up in the air right now, and it's hard to know because we're living in this transitional moment itself. It's very difficult to see and project what will happen with the new world order.
Do you think the UN will relinquish its control over global governance?
The UN may not want to relinquish its control over global governance, but the way things are right now, I see the creation of a number of alternative forms of governance that are popping up all over the place. I mean, from transversal kind of governance to the Group of Seven, Group of 22, the Group of 77. I mean, there are all sorts of pockets of governing institutions that are cropping up and regimes that are popping up that could complement the United Nations. It could complement the United Nations. In many cases, it does, or they do. But sometimes I think they may conflict with the values of the United Nations and may even undermine the United Nations. That's why I'm very concerned about these parallel forms of governance operating outside the UN system, because that same sort of thing happened and caused the demise of the League of Nations. So we don't want that to happen, but the reality is that we're seeing signs of these parallel forms of governments emerging and causing problems for the existing institutions that are there.
Okay. Next question is, how are non-state groups to be included in the discussions leading to a new form of global governance?
Non-state actors have to be at the table, and we have to find a way to do this. I mean, the United Nations Charter, Article 71 of the Charter, allows for the possibility, right, for non-state actors to be involved in decision-making process in the United Nations system. Now, they will never become members of the UN system in the way that states are members of the organization, but they certainly are already being called in, sometimes by state governments. I mean, think of Canadian delegations that go to COP26. See how many non-state actors and prominent individuals are on the Canadian delegation. And you'll see that many of them are non-state actors. Many of them are financiers. Many of them are from the financial sector or the corporate sector. Many of them are from civil societal actors interested in the issue of protecting and preserving the environment. So whether or not the United Nations want to do this, I think it's starting to happen already, where these individuals are being included to some extent in the processes and the functions of global governance. The problem is that there has to be a structure for them to do so on a more regular basis. And I think that's one of the things I'm calling for with this notion of assumative global governance that would embrace all of these different actors into a platform, or have them sit at the table, the decision-making table in the future.
So does the direction suggested, does it signal the demise of democracy as it's being practiced these days? And if so, what is the likely replacement, and whose powers will have to be relinquished?
Right, that's a good question. And I've written a little bit on democracy. And in fact, I have a chapter that's coming out in Tom Weiss and Wilkinson's textbook on democracy. And one of the challenges I think we face is that the democracy that's being imposed on other people by the United States, by the Western powers, that has to end. That sort of enforcement of democracy or foisting democracy on others, that has to end. Democracy ought to be a process that's organic, that works from the bottom up as opposed to from the top down. Many countries have become democratic countries after being autocratic. And now we're seeing almost like a backlash to that, or the embrace of what was called illiberal democracies sprouting up all over the world. And that challenges the notion of a Westphalian notion of democracy. It challenges the United States notion of democracy. And even within the United States itself, there are people who are challenging democracy in the United States. So I think that that whole notion of democracy, which is based solely on electioneering, getting enough votes to get a party into power, that's going to be a thing of the past. Because democracy has to be organic. It should come from the lowest levels within society, should be making decisions about their future. And one of the reasons I call for subsidiarity, and I should explain what subsidiarity means, but it's the notion that, and it's particularly bottom-up subsidiarity, there's a notion that individuals who are affected by decisions that are made ought to be part of the decision-making. And if there's no competency with a legal or material competence, then maybe it goes up to the ladder to another level. And it can keep rising to another level until it gets to the global level. But it should never come from the global level down. It should never come from the United States down to other countries. It should work at the level of local environments first. And I think that would secure the best form of democracy that you can have.
All right, thank you. Is the EU an example of what is possible globally?
Well, yes and no. I think the EU has demonstrated that regional integration can work. But don't forget, I think it was Hawes in 1958 who, after espousing the values of the EU, European Union, as a it wasn't the European Union at that time, but espoused this notion that the European countries can actually get together and integrate. He himself did a book that reversed his position on this and felt that the integration process was failing. And when we look at Britain leaving the EU, and we see many countries within Europe also thinking about the same thing, we have to wonder whether or not this is going to be the best solution. It is a solution, and of course, it's one solution that's also you can find that that the United Nations Charter holds out hope for regional agencies to play a greater role in global politics. If you look at Chapter 8 of the UN Charter, it allows regional organizations, regional agencies to play a greater role in global governance. So there's a role to be had for regional organizations in global governance. But I don't think that the European Union is necessarily the only model. It is a model, and I think many countries like Africa, many countries in Africa have supported it to some extent. And the African Union has followed that model. CARICOM in the Caribbean has followed that model. And maybe ASEAN has also followed that model to some extent. But it's not the only model. I think we have to find ways to have regional bodies that include non-state actors as well as state actors.
Okay. Oh, Dave says, thanks for the entertaining presentation, Andy.
Thank you very much, Dave.
All right. So another question is, says, oh, just a second, my window's flipping here. Another question is, I agree that there are global problems that should be solved globally. Global warming is one. But if major players, for example, China, don't join with others, then I think they will emerge superior in the end because we will be under increased expenses that they don't incur. So this global playing seems fraught with problems. So I guess it's not really a question, but a statement. How would you react to that?
I would agree to a large extent. I was watching COP26 opening session, and I watched the Prime Minister of Barbados. I was very proud of the Prime Minister of Barbados. I was born in Barbados, and Mia Montley, she had a drop mic moment, I think, when she talked about the fact that small states who are particularly vulnerable to climate change, hurricanes, tourism being decimated because of the vulnerabilities of hurricanes and volcanoes and all that sort of thing. I think that she made the point, I think very plain, that unless these people, these actors, are included in the decisions about climate change, and unless the major actors responsible for the degradation of the environment, unless they pay, the small states aren't going to be able to do anything about it. They can't afford to do anything about it. And most of the time, they're not the main polluters anyway. So the onus is now on the big powers, the ones who became, very rich because of industrialization, and as a result, polluted the environment as a result of this. These are the kind of powers that need to be paying the costs of meeting the targets of climate change. And I think that we have to keep pushing that story until they finally wake up and smell the roses. I mean, I think at that COP meeting 26, I saw a lot of people nodding their heads to to Prime Minister Motley's statement, and I think they finally started getting it. But the problem is that they made pledges and never seem to meet those pledges. I think that's the challenge that we have today.
Okay. Now, there's a couple of questions pertaining to Ethiopia. Within the context of your very interesting talk tonight, would you share your thoughts on the current crisis in Ethiopia?
That's a good question. And I have not, it's not one of my areas of specialty of looking specifically at Ethiopia. But I wonder, whether or not the internal problems in Ethiopia are not in some ways linked to the challenge of the nation state not being able to meet the demands of its people. I made a comment recently in a public session about the fact that that sovereignty was no longer sacrosanct, that sovereign states were not able to meet the requirements of sovereignty any longer. And Ethiopia seems to be an example of this. Sudan is a very good example of this now. Yemen is a good example, Myanmar. So I think that there are so many examples out there, including the Ethiopian examples, that shows that the nation state as we knew it, this Westphalian notion of the nation state, is no longer able to deal with the problems that society wants them to address. And as a result, these problems will continue to fester, unfortunately.
Okay. Do you feel that there will have to, the related question in Ethiopia was thinking of what appears to be a disintegration of Ethiopia. Do you feel that there will have to be a reformation of the state system, particularly in Africa, that has such a powerful legacy of imperialism?
Yeah, I know, especially on the African continent. I mean, a lot of the states in Africa are, figments of the Europeans' imagination, or to the people who created these divisions among the African people into sort of Westphalian nation states. And it's no wonder that some of them are falling apart, because they were in some ways artificial, Eurocentric kind of states that were created. The challenge is going to be for the governments in Africa, the governments of individual nation states in Africa, to realize that the problems that they face are common, and they require sort of regional ways of dealing with these problems. Maybe the AU, the African Union, is probably the best hope for Africa, for African states, to work collectively together to bring an end to some of these problems. But the problems are just enormous. I mean, you just think about Nigeria and the challenges of Boko Haram and the herders and there's just enormous problems that many countries in Africa have to face. And these problems aren't going to be resolved by the states acting on their own. So they have to find ways to work together collaboratively to bring those problems to an end.
Okay. What impact do you think the violence of capitalism has on global disorder and governance? Have corporations meddled too much in traditional governmental power structures?
I think capitalism is one of the biggest problems that we have today for the world order that we face. We can see it played out in the anti-globalization movements and the way people are pushing back against capitalist interests. Um, the problem with capitalism is that it's based on a profit motive, and many of the issues that and the values that most people want to see, values of human rights and equity and justice and fairness, many of those things are not considerations for more for corporate interests. They're concerned with the bottom line. They're concerned with profit motive. So until that changes, I'm afraid that we're going to have a problem with capitalism. Um, we may not have to move to a communist society where everybody's kind of treated as equal across the board, but certainly capitalism has to be modified in order to bring about the kind of peaceful coexistence that we need in our world today.
Okay. This next question is on the long side, but I think I'm going to try to summarize it to, do you see non-state actors as having more normative power than the states now? It seems to this person that individuals like Greta Thunberg or corporations like SpaceX are increasing their ability to change the debate of how the globe should be governed.
I
So
don't
do you
think that they're. I don't think. I mean, you have to be very careful in talking about non-state actors as having more power, or more authority, or more influence than the states. I don't want to suggest that states are losing their authority and power and grip that they've had over all these years. I think states are still here to stay, but I think increasingly they're going to be challenged by non-state actors. As you know, some of the richest individuals in the world have more assets than about 150 nation states in the globe. So many of them are small, developing states. So going to be there has to be a challenge with the material interests, right? One of the issues that I try to raise with my students, I go back to Robert Cox's notion that the foundations of world order is based on these three planks, if you will, our foundational planks. One is ideas, the other is institutions, and the third is material capability. That material capability factor is very important, as institutions are, as well as ideas. And if the world's richest people are being called in, as they are with COP26, to help resolve the problems of climate change, and to pour money into that kind of effort, then obviously they're going to have a lot more say and a lot greater stake in the outcome than they had before. And I think that's just natural that rich corporations, rich people, individuals, if they're going to put money into these kinds of initiatives, they're going to want to have a greater say in these initiatives. So we have to bear that in mind when we start to think about whether or not civil societal actors are going to replace the nation state in terms of importance.
Do you think that China's global reach is benign?
No, I can't say that China's global reach is benign. I was in Trinidad and Tobago when Xi Jinping visited the Caribbean for the very first time in 2014. And the impression he gave was that China was rising, but China was rising in a different way than, say, the United States rose or Britain rose or the Netherlands rose to prominence. And his notion of rise was a peaceful rise. That's rhetoric, but I don't think that in reality you can really say that China is peacefully rising with the kind of rhetoric that's being used in the case of Taiwan, or in the case of Hong Kong, or the case with the northern part of China. So we have to be a little bit critical of this notion that somehow China is peacefully rising. It's not a benign power at all. Even the Belt and Road Initiative, which I think has some potential in replacing, the efforts of the IMF and the World Bank and and the kind of Bretton Woods arrangement that we had before, even in the Belt and Road initiatives, there are signs that some countries are not doing as well as they thought they would with Chinese money and Chinese influence. So we have to be careful, and I think we just have to be willing to accept China as a rising power, cooperate with them whenever we have the opportunity to on things that would affect us together on common problems, but also push back a little bit on values that may not be acceptable to our values. And I think that's the only way to go when it comes to China. It's not going to sort of sit back and allow itself to be rolled over, but certainly I think it would react to pressure from other communities around the world if it's seen as being a malign power rather than a benign power.
Okay. Just four more questions, and then I think we'll conclude. Dave asks, the United Nations has always relied on the political will of the leaders of its member states. But without political will from nation states, especially from non-state actors, cooperation is not possible. As an example, the international community is not addressing the Myanmar genocide for political reasons. So is it even possible to achieve political will these days on most issues? And in parentheses, Andy, he understands that you're ever the optimist.
That sounds like David Black, maybe. I'm not sure.
Dave McKay.
David McKay. Okay, David McKay. David McKay. Yes, one of my students. One of my former students, I should say. There's a challenge here, again, for the international community, particularly when it comes to the role that prominent states play in decision making. I think the challenge is one where the nature of the international system itself has changed to the point where even the big powers are having difficulty adjusting to an intermestic era. I like to call it intermestic era because it's no longer just simply an international system where the inside is somehow completely separated from the outside, where you can sort of filter out any sort of problems penetrating your borders. I mean, we saw this with 9/11, we saw this in other cases where even big states are having difficulties protecting their people from influences from outside. Furthermore, protecting the people from influences within the state is now becoming a severe problem. So that has to be a consideration here. So before we even talk about the impact of big states within the United Nations system, they're going to have to address the internal problems that they face first before they can start to address the other problems that the international community faces. I hope that helps. It's not the most optimistic answer, but I try to remain an optimist under those current conditions.
Okay. This question has to do with neoliberalism. While it may be true that the nation state is losing their dominance to non-state actors and multilateralism, some may argue that the interests of the dominant powers are still able to influence the decision-making of multilateral institutions and other non-state actors, primarily because those entities are made up of individuals from those dominant powers, and the culture of those organizations reflect their thinking. So are we seeing a decline in the importance of neoliberal institutionalism?
We're certainly seeing a challenge to neoliberal institutionalism. That was really the foundation upon which the post-1945 world order was built. And as Robert Cost would say, when you start to see challenges to the ideas as one of the foundational planks of world order, then you know something is happening, something is shifting. And then when you start to see challenges to the institutions themselves that supposedly to be sort of perpetuating those ideas, then you know you're in serious problems. When you start to see challenges to the material capabilities that supported those institutions, then you really know that the world order is crumbling. I think we have to recognize and acknowledge the fact that the world order is crumbling. Even the big powers, the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council, have difficulties in addressing this. And the changes that are necessary, which might include reforming the Security Council, these things are not going to happen anytime soon because, will Britain give up its seat, for example,
Mm.
uh, on the Security Council? Will France give up its seat on the Security Council for other countries? Will the Chinese accept India or Pakistan as permanent members of the Security Council? Those kind of issues that are really reformist kind of issues have to be addressed, and they're not being properly addressed right now. And that's one of the reasons I think there is a room, a scope here for parallel institutions to develop outside of the ambit of the UN system that may force the UN then to make the changes that are necessary.
Okay. All right, two more. One is, why has the UN been so unsuccessful in making and keeping peace?
I would rephrase that. I don't know who asked
Okay.
that question, but I would rephrase that. I don't think that the UN has been totally unsuccessful in maintaining peace. In fact, if you look at the history of the United Nations on the various secretaries general, you'll see the creation of peacekeeping organizations, peacekeeping arrangements, peace building arrangements, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration of arrangements, the protection of human rights in cases where people were being slaughtered. You still see the signs that the United Nations is trying its best to help in those cases. So it's not been a total loss. I mean, I think I would not say that the UN has been totally successful, but in many cases it hasn't been successful primarily not because of the institution itself, but because of the member states who make up the United Nations system, particularly the larger member states, the most powerful member states, the member states with the veto, that use the veto to wield power and to make sure that certain interests that they have aren't going to be touched by decision making of the entire body. So I wouldn't blame the entire United Nations for the failures. I would blame the member states of the United Nations who make up the membership of the organization.
All right. And the final question, a bit one for you, a little on the personal side. How are you finding life any different now that you're living in the United States?
Well, you got to give me a little bit, a little bit of time. I've only been here since October, so I don't think I had enough time to really see any difference yet, except for the weather. But I'm coming from Edmonton, of course. But I think I'm getting a sense that the challenges of the United States, when it comes, especially political challenges, are much, much greater than what we see in Canada. We have our little problems, liberals and conservatives and NDP and the Greens and so on, but it's nothing compared to the kind of vitriol that I'm seeing here between Republicans and Democrats, between anti-vaxxers and people who support vaccinations. It's ugly in the United States, and I feel badly because this is our neighbor, and I think Lloyd Asworthy used to say that living alongside the United States is like making love to a porcupine. You can do it, but it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be easy at all. So we have as neighbors, we have to obviously be concerned by where the United States is headed because we're kind of stuck in proximity to the United States. And a lot of what happens in the United States is going to affect us almost immediately. But I think we have to be willing to push back against some of the things that are happening in the United States if we want to hold true to values that we consider to be Canadian values.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Andy. That concludes the Q&A section of the talk. A lot of interesting questions, and I'd like to thank you very, very much for giving us a very, very entertaining and highly informative talk.
Thank you, Luca, and thanks to everyone for coming. I really wish it was an in-person kind of presentation, but maybe one day you'll get to see copies of the book that's coming out on this topic. And I hope that you'll be willing to offer comments, suggestions, criticisms. To me, I'm willing to accept and embrace those and try to make the book a little bit better. Thank you very much for your
Okay,
time and
definitely.
attention.
Thank you, definitely. So I'd like to thank everybody for attending this evening and for your insightful and thoughtful questions. We've been once again reminded why the university exists, right? It's a place to learn and teach, to debate and question, to inspire and be inspired, and a place to challenge and a place to connect. So thank you to the team of friends who worked behind the scenes to make this webinar a success. We are all volunteers, and we'd like anybody that is thinking about joining to join our ranks. Just go to the website, click join, and you won't be asked for money. You'll just be getting notices of the wonderful things that the friends do here. So thanks again for joining in this evening. We look forward to connecting with you at future Friends events. And so everyone, good evening, and thank you very much, Andy, and have a good evening yourself.
Thank you very much. All the best.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.